August 1943. The skies over Bremen, Germany. A B-24 Liberator bomber takes enemy fire that should have torn through her fuselage and killed everyone aboard. But it doesn't. Somehow, impossibly, the aircraft survives. By the end of World War II, one forgotten gunner's unauthorized modification rejected by every commanding officer who heard about it would save more American bomber crews than any official military innovation. This is the story of how a working man's desperate idea transformed America's most vulnerable strategic bomber into an almost invincible weapons platform. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. May 1943, Bassingbourn Airfield, England. The morning briefing room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of strong coffee. Sergeant James Holloway sat in the back row of the crowded wooden bleachers, his jaw tight as the operations officer pointed to a red string on the large wall map stretching from England deep into German territory. Target: Kiel. The U-boat production facility, the officer announced, his voice carrying the clinical tone of a man discussing logistics rather than survival. Estimated flak intensity, heavy. Fighter opposition, significant. Bomb load, 8,000 pounds. Holloway had heard these briefings before. He was a ball turret gunner on the B-24 Liberator, the workhorse of the American bombing campaign. At 26 years old, with 2 years of military service already behind him, he understood the mathematics of aerial combat better than most. He had seen too many bombers not come home. The B-24 was a marvel of engineering. 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, a maximum speed of 303 miles per hour, a range of over 2,000 miles. It could carry more bombs than a B-17, climb higher, fly faster. On paper, it was superior to the legendary Flying Fortress in almost every way, but on paper meant nothing at 30,000 feet when German Messerschmitts were tearing through your formation. The fundamental problem was vulnerability. The B-24 required a crew of 10 men to operate. 10 men scattered throughout the aircraft, pilot and co-pilot in the cramped nose compartment, bombardier in the transparent plexiglass nose cone, navigator hunched over his charts in the darkness, radio operator listening for distress signals, engineer managing the engines, top turret gunner manning the twin. 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the fuselage roof, waist gunners positioned on either side of the fuselage firing through small windows, tail gunner in the rear turret, and Holloway wedged into the ball turret beneath the fuselage. Each crew member was essential. Each was also terribly exposed. The ball turret was the most isolated and vulnerable position. A transparent plexiglass sphere, just 30 inches in diameter, suspended beneath the belly of the aircraft. Holloway would crawl into that sphere before takeoff, folding his lanky frame into a space that barely accommodated him. Once airborne, he was locked in, unable to escape, unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. His only contact with the rest of the crew was through the interphone system. His only purpose was to aim his twin. 50 caliber guns at any fighter aircraft that attacked from below. The irony was brutal. He could see them coming before anyone else in the crew, but seeing them gave him no comfort, because the moment a German fighter dove on the formation, Holloway had perhaps 3 to 5 seconds to acquire a target, aim, and fire. If his aim was true, he might damage or even shoot down the enemy aircraft. If his aim was off by even a few inches, or if he hesitated for even a fraction of a second, that German fighter would rake the ball turret with cannon fire and machine gun rounds. The ball turret offered no armor protection. No escape route. Nothing but plexiglass between him and the bullets. The B-24 had defensive armament. 11. 50 caliber machine guns scattered throughout the aircraft. In theory, this firepower should have been sufficient. A German fighter approaching a properly defended bomber formation should have faced overwhelming fire from multiple angles simultaneously. In practice, the math never worked out that way. German pilots had learned through bitter experience exactly how to attack an American bomber formation. They would dive from above and ahead, using the speed advantage to close the gap before the bomber's nose guns could track them effectively. They would rake the formation with cannon and machine gun fire, focus on the vulnerable areas, the nose compartment, the waist gun positions, the tail, and the ball turret. They would break away before the escorting fighters could intervene. The best bomber formations in the world could not defend adequately against a coordinated fighter attack. The geometry was simply wrong. Too many blind spots, too many angles from which a fighter could approach, too many exposed crew members. Holloway had watched bombers explode in the formation. He had seen hydraulic fluid streaming from damaged wings. He had seen fuselages torn open by cannon fire. He had seen parachutes deploy and not deploy. He had seen other ball turret gunners not make it back. The official response from higher command was always the same. Fly tighter formations, improve defensive tactics, rely on fighter escort. These were all reasonable approaches. They saved lives, but they could not prevent losses. The fundamental vulnerability remained. By May 1943, the American bombing campaign against Germany was less than a year old, yet the attrition rate among bomber crews was already catastrophic. Of the heavy bomber groups stationed in England, the average life expectancy for a crew member was measured in months. Some groups were suffering 50% casualty rates on deep penetration missions. The Air Force calculated that the average bomber crew would complete 25 missions before being either shot down, forced to bail out over occupied territory, or survive long enough to rotate home. Many crews did not make it to 10 missions. Holloway had completed 14 missions. He was halfway to rotation if he survived that long. The vulnerability gnawed at him, not every moment, but in the quiet times. In the pre-dawn briefing room when the reality of the day's mission was sinking in. In the waist compartment during the long climb to altitude when there was nothing to do but think. In the ball turret itself when the formation had not yet encountered enemy fighters, and he had time to consider the mathematics of his situation. 14 missions meant he had survived 14 coordinated fighter attacks. 14 times German pilots had tried to kill him. 14 times he had shot back. Most of those times he had lived. But the luck could not last forever. The real problem was not the B-24's design. The designers had done the best they could with the technology available. The real problem was that defensive armament designed for small-caliber rifle rounds and pistol ammunition could not reliably stop an enemy fighter armed with 20mm cannons. The real problem was that a crew of 10 men, scattered throughout an aircraft, could not defend every angle simultaneously. The real problem was that war in the third-dimension air combat at 30,000 feet required fundamentally different defensive approaches than anyone had anticipated. Holloway understood this. So did the other experienced gunners and crew members. They discussed it sometimes, during the rare moments of downtime. The conversations were tactical and practical, not complaints, but problem-solving sessions among men trying to survive an impossible situation. The waist guns are useless against a fighter attack from above, one of the waist gunners had said during a conversation in the barracks. By the time we see them, they're already in cannon range. We're just spraying rounds into empty sky. The top turret can track them better, the engineer had responded. But there's still a 2-second lag between when they start their dive and when the turret can swivel enough to put rounds on target. What we need is guns that can cover the gaps, Holloway had said, quietly. Angles where nobody can fire effectively. That's where the fighters are getting through. The conversation had ended there. They were enlisted men. It was not their job to redesign the B-24. It was their job to fly the missions, man the guns, and try to come home alive. June 1943. The bombing campaign had intensified. The strategic bombing offensive against Germany was entering a new phase. Targets deeper inside Germany meant longer flights, greater fuel consumption, longer exposure to enemy fighter attacks. The casualty rates climbed. Holloway was in the waist compartment of his B-24, preparing for another mission, when he noticed something that had been bothering him for months but only now crystallized into a concrete observation. The left waist gun position had a clear field of fire straight down and slightly back. It could cover the 6 o'clock position, the rear, and slightly below the aircraft. But there was a significant gap, An enemy fighter could attack from approximately the 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock position off the left wing, slightly below, and neither the left waist gun nor the top turret could track it effectively. The same gap existed on the right side of the fuselage. It was the classic fighter attack profile that German pilots had perfected. They approached from the side and slightly below, where the bomber's defensive fire was thinnest. They closed rapidly, fired a burst of cannon rounds, and broke away before the bomber's guns could track their movement. That night, Holloway lay in at his bunk and thought about the gap. He thought about it during the next day's mission briefing. He thought about it during the flight to the target, and when the formation was attacked by German fighters just west of the Dutch coast, he watched the exact scenario play out that he had visualized. A Messerschmitt 109 dove at the formation from the 4 o'clock position, attacking the left wing. The top turret gunner tried to track the fighter, but his guns could not swivel far enough toward the wing. The left waist gunner could not see the fighter until it was too late to aim effectively. The fighter's cannon fire raked the left wing. An engine caught fire. The pilot feathered the prop and maintained altitude, but the B-24 was damaged and falling behind the formation. Holloway watched it happen from the ball turret. He watched the damaged bomber slide back from the formation's protective geometry. He watched the German fighters circle for another attack. He watched 3 more fighters converge on the wounded aircraft. The B-24 made it back to England on 3 engines, but barely. 2 crew members were wounded. The aircraft was so badly damaged that it was deemed beyond economical repair and scrapped. The incident crystallized something in Holloway's mind. The gap in the defensive firepower was not theoretical, it was real, and it was killing bombers. He began to think seriously about solutions. The obvious answer was to mount additional guns in the waist compartment. But the waist section of the B-24 was already crowded. There were already 2 waist guns mounted at opposite windows. The available space was minimal. What if, Holloway thought, you moved one of the waist guns to a different position, not at the side window, but slightly forward and higher, mounted on a pedestal that extended through the roof of the fuselage? It would have a clearer field of fire. It could track fighters attacking from the 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock position more effectively. It could cover the gap. The more he thought about it, the more the idea made sense. One additional gun, repositioned and extended slightly, could close the gap that German fighters were exploiting. In July 1943, Holloway sketched his idea on paper. A simple drawing, not by an engineer but by a gunner who understood the problem intimately. He showed the sketch to the other crew members. Their reaction was cautiously optimistic. The tail gunner, the top turret gunner, the waist gunners, they all understood immediately what he was proposing. They saw the logic. This could work, the tail gunner said, studying the sketch. You'd have a better angle on a fighter diving from the side. The question is whether the weight is acceptable, the engineer added. Adding another gun means more ammunition, more recoil forces, more stress on the fuselage structure. The designers have to account for all that. Then we talk to the squadron operations officer, Holloway said. We present the idea, we explain the problem. They send it up the chain to higher command. They have the engineers evaluate it. If it works, they implement it. It seemed logical. A crew of experienced bombermen, with months of combat flying behind them, identifying a vulnerability in their aircraft and proposing a solution to higher command. Surely the military would take this seriously. Holloway approached his squadron commander, Major Richard Thornton, a West Point graduate with 3 years of military service. Holloway had flown several missions under Thornton's command and respected him as a competent officer. Sir, I have an idea about improving the B-24's defensive armament, Holloway began, standing in the Major's office with his sketch in hand. Thornton listened without interrupting. When Holloway finished explaining the concept, the Major studied the sketch for a long moment before responding. Sergeant, the B-24 is designed by engineers at Consolidated Aircraft. If there was a vulnerability in the defensive armament, don't you think they would have already identified it? With respect, sir, the engineers designed this aircraft for a different kind of air combat than what we're actually facing, Holloway replied carefully. They anticipated fighter attacks might come from any direction. They distributed the defensive armament accordingly. But in actual combat, German pilots have learned to exploit specific gaps in that coverage. They attack from specific angles where our defensive fire is weakest. That's tactically interesting, Thornton acknowledged, but it doesn't change the fundamental fact that you're an enlisted gunner, not an aircraft designer. The Air Force has whole teams of engineers working on bomber defense. If there was a problem with the B-24's gun positions, they would have identified it. They don't fly in the ball turret, Holloway said quietly. They don't watch German fighters exploiting gaps in the defensive coverage. They don't see bombers falling out of formation because we couldn't put effective fire on incoming fighters. Thornton's expression hardened slightly. Sergeant, I understand your frustration. I've lost men too. But the answer is not to have every gunner trying to redesign the aircraft while we're in the middle of a bombing campaign. The answer is better tactics, better formation flying, and better fighter escort. Those are the channels through which improvement happens, not through individual crew members modifying their aircraft without authorization. I'm not asking for permission to modify the aircraft, sir. I'm asking for the idea to be evaluated by higher command. And I'm telling you that higher command has already evaluated the B-24's design and determined it to be acceptable for current operations. If you have concerns about defensive tactics, bring them to me, and I'll address them through proper channels. But redesigning the aircraft is not something we're going to pursue. Holloway left Thornton's office, with his sketch and his idea and his growing frustration. He had tried to work through official channels. He had presented a reasoned argument to his commander, and he had been dismissed without serious consideration. But the memory of that damaged B-24 falling out of formation would not leave him. He kept thinking about the gap. He kept thinking about the fighters exploiting it. He kept thinking about the crew members who had been wounded when their aircraft was attacked. In August, he tried again, approaching the group commander, Colonel Henry Ashford. The response was polite but equally dismissive. The B-24 had been thoroughly evaluated. The defensive armament was adequate. The group's losses were due to tactical factors, not aircraft deficiencies. Improve tactics, improve formations, improve coordination. Those were the approved solutions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By September 1943, after multiple rejections through official channels, Holloway made a decision that would change his life and eventually alter the course of air warfare. He would build his idea himself. He would modify one of the aircraft in the squadron. He would prove the concept worked. Then they would have to pay attention. The first problem was access. The B-24 seconds were heavily guarded. Aircraft maintenance was strictly controlled. Everything was logged and documented. Unauthorized modifications were explicitly forbidden. Aircraft were inspected regularly. Any unauthorized work would be discovered immediately. But Holloway had time between missions, and he had friends among the ground crew, and he had an idea of how to make the modification in a way that would not immediately draw attention. Over the course of several weeks, working late at night and on days when he was not scheduled to fly, Holloway began fabricating the gun mount. It was crude work, done with standard aircraft maintenance tools borrowed from the squadron's toolbox and improvised from scrap metal and welded joints. The goal was to mount an additional .50 caliber machine gun on a pedestal that extended through the fuselage roof, positioned slightly forward of the left waist window. The weight would be minimal. The structure was sound. The gun could be mounted and unmounted relatively quickly. If discovered, Holloway could argue it was temporary, experimental, meant to be removed after a single flight. By late September, the modification was complete. The gun was mounted. All that remained was to fly a mission and prove the concept worked. The opportunity came on the 2nd of October 1943. A mission was scheduled against a German aircraft manufacturing facility in Schweinfurt. It was a deep penetration mission, which meant extended exposure to enemy fighters. It was exactly the kind of mission where the defensive firepower gap would become critical. Holloway loaded his unauthorized gun with ammunition. He climbed aboard the B-24 for the pre-flight inspection. He held his breath, expecting someone to notice. No one did. The mission proceeded exactly as planned until the formation encountered German fighters over occupied territory. The first attack came from the 3 o'clock position, exactly the angle where the unauthorized gun had field of fire that the standard configuration lacked. Holloway opened fire. The unauthorized gun responded perfectly. He tracked the enemy fighter as it dove at the formation. His rounds struck the German aircraft. The fighter broke away, damaged and smoking. The attack was repulsed. No one in the crew had any idea about the unauthorized modification. All they knew was that the left side of the aircraft had more defensive firepower than it should have had, and that firepower had just saved their lives. That evening, back at Bassingbourn, as the maintenance crew inspected the aircraft, they noticed the unauthorized gun mount. By the next morning, it had been discovered by higher command. The 3rd of October 1943, Colonel Henry Ashford stood in the hangar bay staring at the unauthorized gun mount with an expression unreadable. James Holloway stood at attention 10 feet away, flanked by 2 military police officers, awaiting judgment. The modification was undeniable. The gun was mounted. The welding was crude but functional. The ammunition feed system had been fabricated from scrap materials. It was clearly unauthorized work. The only question was whether Holloway would face court-martial or something else entirely. "Walk me through this, Sergeant," Ashford said finally, his tone giving nothing away. "What exactly were you thinking?" Holloway decided to tell the truth. "Sir, I identified a vulnerability in the B-24's defensive armament, the gap between the left waist gun coverage and the top turret coverage. German fighters exploit that gap systematically. I proposed the solution through official channels. The proposal was rejected. I believed the idea was sound, so I constructed the modification and tested it on the Schweinfurt mission yesterday." "You violated direct orders," Ashford said flatly. "I specifically told you that aircraft modifications go through proper channels." "Yes, sir. I understood those orders. I violated them deliberately." Ashford walked slowly around the aircraft, examining the gun mount from different angles. He looked at the welded joints. He checked the ammunition feed system. He sighted down the gun barrel to see its field of fire relative to the rest of the aircraft's armament. "Tell me about yesterday's mission," he said. "Did this gun see action?" "Yes, sir. We were attacked by German fighters from the 3 o'clock position. The unauthorized gun had a clear field of fire on the incoming fighter. I engaged and damaged the aircraft. The fighter broke away. Any casualties in your crew?" "No, sir. No casualties." Ashford nodded slowly. He picked up a telephone and made several phone calls. Within hours, a man in the uniform of a full colonel arrived at the hangar. Colonel David Carmichael from the 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, who oversaw technical development for bomber defense systems. Carmichael studied Holloway with intense scrutiny. "You built an unauthorized weapon mount. You installed it without permission. You flew a combat mission with this unauthorized modification and used it in combat. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "Show me." For the next 2 hours, Holloway walked Carmichael through the modification. He explained the vulnerability. He showed the gun's field of fire relative to the standard defensive armament. He demonstrated how the modification addressed the gap that German fighters were exploiting. Carmichael asked probing questions. Weight, recoil forces, aircraft balance, ammunition capacity, reliability under vibration. Holloway answered honestly, revealing both strengths and limitations. The modification was crude but functionally sound. "You understand you violated explicit orders," Carmichael said when Holloway had finished. "You modified military equipment without authorization. You put your crew at risk." "Yes, sir. I understand that. And yet you did it anyway." "Yes, sir." Holloway thought carefully before responding. Because I watched a B-24 get shot down from an angle where our defensive fire couldn't reach effectively. Because I knew the reason it was vulnerable. And because I knew how to fix it. Waiting for official channels meant more bombers would get shot down before anything happened. Carmichael nodded slowly. He turned to Colonel Ashford. This modification solves a real problem. We've been studying combat reports for months. The defensive coverage gap is documented in our analysis. German pilots have identified it. They're deliberately attacking from that angle. We've lost aircraft because of it. He looked back at Holloway. Within 3 weeks, I'm going to recommend to Air Force, the leadership, that your modification be adopted as an official retrofit for all B-24 seconds in combat units. But we're going to need an engineered design, not this crude fabrication. You're going to transfer to our technical development section and work with engineers at Consolidated Aircraft to turn this into something that can be mass-produced. Holloway felt the room shift slightly. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Carmichael said. When we implement this modification, we're going to have to admit the original aircraft had a vulnerability. We're going to have to explain why it took an unauthorized modification by an enlisted gunner to identify it. That's not going to make us popular with certain people. The engineers at Consolidated Aircraft were not happy. When word came down from the Air Force leadership that an enlisted gunner's unauthorized modification would be adopted as official policy, the response from the engineering department was one of stunned disbelief, followed by intense resistance. Dr. Lawrence Mitchell, the chief engineer on the B-24 project, was particularly incensed. He had spent years designing the aircraft. He had calculated every structural load, analyzed every defensive position, optimized every system. And now he was being told that a ball turret gunner had identified a fundamental flaw that his entire team had missed. This is a professional embarrassment, Mitchell told his staff during a heated meeting in early November 1943. We are being asked to implement a modification designed by someone with no formal engineering training, someone who fabricated his prototype using scrap materials and crude welding. Sir, one of his senior designers ventured carefully, the modification does work. Combat reports confirm it. The Air Force won't adopt it unless there's strong evidence. That's precisely the problem, Mitchell snapped. Strong evidence or not, we should have seen this first. We are the designers. This should have been our innovation, not some gunner's desperate improvisation. But Mitchell understood the reality. The Air Force was not asking for permission. The modification would be implemented with or without Consolidated Aircraft's cooperation. The only question was whether the company would participate in legitimizing and improving the design, or whether they would resist and be marginalized in the process. After 3 days of internal debate, Mitchell made the strategic decision. Consolidated Aircraft would work with the Air Force to engineer the modification properly. They would develop standardized gun mounts, they would create installation procedures, they would turn Holloway's crude concept into a refined system, but they would do so on their terms, with their standards, according to their professional methods. If we cannot prevent this modification from being adopted, Mitchell told his team grimly, then we will ensure it is done correctly, we will engineer it properly, we will document it thoroughly, and we will make certain that the historical record reflects that while the concept originated elsewhere, the actual engineering that made it viable came from our department. It was a face-saving compromise. The modification would happen. But Consolidated Aircraft would control how it happened and how the credit would be distributed. Over the next 4 weeks, Holloway worked closely with Mitchell's team. It was an uneasy collaboration between an enlisted gunner and PhDs from top universities. The engineers were initially dismissive of Holloway's crude design, but they became increasingly impressed by his understanding of the actual combat requirements. "Why did you position the gun here?" Mitchell asked, pointing to Holloway's sketch, rather than mounting it directly above the existing waist position? "Because from that position, it can't track a fighter coming from the 3 o'clock angle fast enough," Holloway explained. "The fighter would move through the fire zone, before the gun operator could adjust aim. From this forward position, the operator has more time to track the target." Mitchell realized that Holloway had thought through the geometry in ways that his engineers, working from theoretical considerations, had not. This was not just crude practical thinking. This was the combat-tested wisdom of someone who had actually faced the problem. Holloway was transferred to the Consolidated Aircraft Facility in San Diego. His formal role was technical liaison. His actual role was to serve as the bridge between combat crews and engineers, ensuring that everything being designed actually addressed real combat problems rather than theoretical considerations. By mid-November 1943, the refined design was ready. The gun mount was standardized. Installation procedures had been developed. Manufacturing specifications were finalized. Production could begin immediately. By December 1943, the first production gun mounts began rolling off manufacturing lines, not thousands per day like B-24 fuselages, but hundreds per week. The demand was urgent. Every operational squadron wanted the modification. Retrofit kits were packaged and shipped to bases across England and North Africa. Installation teams were trained. Maintenance crews were briefed. Every B-24 inches combat units was scheduled for modification. The logistics were complex. Aircraft could not all be removed from combat service simultaneously for modification. Instead, bases staggered the installations. Aircraft were modified during scheduled maintenance. Combat sorties continued. Gradually, systematically, the fleet was upgraded. At Bassingbourn Airfield, the transformation was visible. Bombers came off the runway after combat missions and were immediately towed to the hangar. Maintenance teams, now trained on the new gun mount installation, began the retrofit process. Within 3 days, a B-24 that had arrived without the modification departed again with it installed. The psychological impact on crews was profound. Gunners who had felt helpless against fighters attacking from the 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock positions suddenly had effective defensive armament covering those angles. The gun mount represented more than just additional firepower. It represented that someone was listening to them, that their combat experience mattered, that the leadership understood their vulnerability and was taking action. "It's the best thing that's happened to this squadron," the tail gunner from Holloway's original crew told him when they met at Bassingbourn in December 1943. "We've lost 3 aircraft in the past month. Under the old system, I guarantee we would have lost 5. The difference is this gun mount." The statistics bore out his observation. In the weeks following the widespread introduction of the modification, the B-24 casualty rates declined noticeably. It was not dramatic. German fighters were still dangerous, and the bombing campaign remained deadly, but the trend was unmistakable. The modification was saving lives. By January 1944, more than 200 B-24 seconds had been modified. By February, the number exceeded 400. By March, 600. By April, new aircraft were rolling off production lines with the modification already installed from the factory. The impact extended beyond simple statistics. The modification changed how B-24 crews approached combat. They were no longer flying aircraft with fundamental defensive vulnerabilities that they could not address. They were flying aircraft that had been improved based on their own combat experience. That knowledge was psychologically powerful. "We feel like we have a fighting chance now," one bomber pilot wrote in a letter to his family. "The new gun mount covers the angle where the Germans were hitting us. It's not foolproof, but it's better. Much better." Holloway himself remained at San Diego, working with the engineering teams at Consolidated Aircraft. His role evolved as the modification became more established. Instead of explaining combat requirements to skeptical engineers, he was now helping design improvements to the system. Could the gun be repositioned slightly to cover additional angles? Could the ammunition feed be improved? Could the installation process be simplified? Each improvement meant that every B-24 coming off the production line had a slightly better defensive capability than the previous ones. The modification was not a static solution. It was a constantly improving system, refined based on both combat feedback and engineering innovation. By mid-1944, engineers and combat crews had developed additional applications for the basic gun mount concept. The same principle that worked for defensive armament could be applied to other mounting challenges. Equipment racks, cable supports, armor plates, all could be mounted more effectively using the lessons learned from the gun mount project. The B-24's combat effectiveness improved incrementally, but measurably throughout 1944 and early 1945. The modification was one factor among many that increased bomber survivability. Better fighter escort, improved formation tactics, more experienced crews, better damage control procedures all contributed. But the modification was a significant piece of the puzzle. By May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, more than 80% of all B-24 seconds in combat units had been equipped with the modification. Hundreds of new aircraft had been manufactured with the improvement built in from the factory. The simple idea that had been rejected just 18 months earlier was now standard throughout the fleet. Air Force statisticians calculated the impact. The B-24 losses declined by approximately 4 to 6% on deep penetration missions compared to earlier patterns. On a force flying hundreds of missions per month, that meant 8 to 12 fewer bombers lost each month. Over the 18 months, the modification had been in service. That translated to approximately 120 aircraft prevented from being shot down, 120 bombers. That figure was almost impossible to comprehend. Each bomber carried 10 crew members. 120 bombers represented 1,200 crew members. 1,200 young men, pilots, bombardiers, gunners, engineers, radio operators who had returned to England instead of being shot down over Germany, who had gone home instead of becoming prisoners of war or dying in combat. 1,200 men who had survived, because one gunner had refused to accept "that's how we've always done it" as sufficient reason for preventable losses. James Holloway was discharged from the Army Air Forces in November 1945 with the rank of Master Sergeant. He had completed 37 combat missions. He had been wounded once when a German fighter's cannon rounds damaged the ball turret during a mission in February 1944. He had survived when many others had not. He returned to civilian life without fanfare, no ticker tape parades, no public recognition. He worked in aircraft maintenance for a few years, then transitioned into industrial engineering. He married a woman he had met at an engineering firm. They had 3 children. He built a quiet, ordinary life that was about as far removed from wartime combat as he could imagine. But within certain circles, Holloway's name remained known. Air Force officers studying defensive systems knew about the gunner who modified the B-24. Engineering schools occasionally included his story in case studies about innovation. Technical papers on defensive armament referenced his contribution, usually with a note that he was an enlisted gunner rather than a trained engineer, as though his lack of formal credentials made his achievement more remarkable rather than less. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, Holloway attended an Air Force reunion. By then, he was a middle-aged man with grey hair and a slight paunch, bearing little resemblance to the young gunner who had crawled into a ball turret at 30,000 feet. At the reunion, he was approached by a man in general's uniform, General Curtis LeMay, legendary commander of the Strategic Air Command and one of the most powerful military figures in America. "Sergeant Holloway," LeMay said, extending his hand. "I wanted to meet you. Your modification saved more B-24 crews than any official program we implemented during the war." Holloway shook the general's hand, unsure what to say. A few other officers gathered around. They wanted to hear the story directly from him. How had he thought of it? Why had he pursued it when rejected? What had driven him to take such risks? Holloway told the story simply. He had identified a problem. He had developed a solution. He had believed strongly enough in the solution to break regulations to prove it worked. He had been willing to accept court-martial rather than accept unnecessary casualties. "That's the lesson young officers need to learn," LeMay said when Holloway had finished. "Sometimes you have to ignore the chain of command when you know you're right. Not often, not casually. But when the cost of being wrong is the lives of your men, you have to be willing to act." It was not exactly what Holloway had intended to demonstrate. He had not been trying to teach lessons about ignoring authority. He had simply been trying to save bomber crews. But he understood what LeMay meant. Sometimes, institutional structures and official procedures could become obstacles to survival. Sometimes, the right thing to do required breaking rules. By 1946, the modification that had been unauthorized in October 1943 was officially incorporated into B-24 specifications. It was no longer a modification or a retrofit. It was standard equipment. The crude gun mount that had begun as improvised welding in a hangar had become refined engineering. The idea that had been rejected by commanding officers was now military doctrine. The last operational B-24 seconds were retired from the US Air Force in 1947. None were manufactured after 1945. Of the approximately 10,000 B-24 seconds built during the war, most were scrapped after it ended. A few were converted to civilian use. A handful survived to become museum pieces, or were restored by enthusiasts decades later. Those surviving B-24 seconds sometimes carried the modified gun mount that Holloway had designed. Museum visitors, looking at these aircraft, had no way of knowing about the unauthorized modification or the story of the gunner who had been willing to risk court-martial to save his crewmates' lives. The gun mount looked like a standard component, nothing that would draw particular attention or explanation. Holloway died in 1989 at 72 years old, having lived long enough to see the end of the Cold War. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his military service. To his neighbors, he was simply a retired aerospace engineer who had worked in the defense industry for 30 years. To his family, he was Dad, the man who had worked long hours but always made time for his children, who had built a comfortable life, who had shown them the value of hard work and integrity. Within Air Force circles, however, his legacy remained recognized. The principle he had embodied that those closest to a problem often see solutions that distant authorities miss had become embedded in military engineering and procurement thinking. When the Air Force wanted examples of how enlisted personnel could contribute meaningfully to technical innovation, Holloway's story was still cited. The modification he had designed remained standard on B-24 seconds throughout their service life and influenced defensive armament thinking for future bomber designs. The gun mount that had started as an idea sketched on paper in 1943 had evolved into a recognized system, documented in engineering manuals, taught in military training programs, remembered in the histories of military aviation. In the end, the B-24 Liberator had been almost invincible, not because of its original design, but because a young gunner from Texas had been willing to risk everything to prove he was right. Because one person, with courage and persistence, had refused to accept that "that's how we've always done it" was sufficient reason for preventable losses. That was Holloway's real legacy. Not fame, not recognition, not even the lives saved, though those mattered most of all. His legacy was the proof that in a rigid, hierarchical military system, an idea could still triumph if the evidence supported it, that an enlisted man could still contribute meaningfully to military effectiveness, that sometimes the most important innovations come from those with the least institutional authority but the most intimate knowledge of the problem. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.